Hey, Dennis, what time did I tell them I was going to have this to them?
Lord, I thought you said you was going to have it done by 1 o'clock here. The whole day's gone by. What's going on?
Oh, my God. Well, I better get it. I better start then and get her done. Hey, I am Sheila K. Adams, and I am standing here in Madison County, North Carolina, but I am at the Georgia Mountain Storytelling Festival, and I am so proud to be here. I've been thinking today, now this seems really kind of odd for me because I didn't exactly realize when you're seeing my cat go out the window and down into the floor, and a pretty good thump because she's a big girl. But anyway, going on stage has got its own, when you step foot on the stage, it's got its own kind of magic. And what I'm finding, though, is that I can do everything that I did before and never have to leave the house. Of course, you might have a cat wandering back and forth, and she might try to help me sing, which is what I'm going to start out with. Because when you talk about storytelling, for me, I never thought of myself as being a storyteller. Because what I had done all of my life, growing up here in Madison County, where you are right now, welcome to Eskey's Ridge in Madison County, North Carolina. But, we would, when I was growing up, I would listen to the old folks that are around home, and, they didn't tell stories in the way that folks at Jonesboro started telling. And David Holt and Connie Reagan Blake got me into the National Storytelling Festival in '97. And I argued with both of them and said, I don't know, I can't tell stories like y'all do. And David said, well, now I know all the people that you talk about. They're real people. And he said, you give little short clips every time that you sing one of their songs, and if you could just sort of stretch, and Connie said, that's right, stretch that out, then it'll be a good story. And so I remembered when I was when my kids were growing up, that I would make up a story for them every night. And so I got to telling more and more just stories and really enjoyed it because all my stories are about characters over home, which, by the way, is Sodom. And I am right now about 20 minutes away from where I grew up in this little mountain community of Sodom. And in that community, there were still singing what's called traditional Scottish and English ballads that were brought over here by our people back in the early 1700s. They were the big story songs, and they do tell a story. They start at the beginning, go all the way. Sometimes that middle part that, has the really good stuff in it, it'll go all the way to 30 or 40 verses. And that was part of the way that I was entertained growing up. No telephone. We did have electricity, though. But when party lines came in for the telephone that we finally got when I was 13 or 14, now that's a whole different set of stories. And what I want to do tonight for the lovely folks here at the Georgia Mountain Storytelling Festival, and I would like to thank Ruth and Amanda for putting this together, because this has to be a challenge for anybody to do. And I'm just proud as punch that they chose me to be a part of this year's festival. And I know that later on, or maybe earlier, that you have seen my cousin Josh Goforth. So now if we'd been at the festival together, we'd be playing music together. But this will do, and you're gonna love Josh. But I was thinking, well, now what kind of a story do you reckon these folks would want to hear? Which comes to my explanation about why I wasn't out here sooner. It's because I had a tooth issue. It just blew up all at once, and I had planned on getting all this recorded and turned in at the beginning of the week, actually. And Ruth and Amanda have been so patient with me And so I decided after the tooth issue and how I'm not in Georgia, but I certainly am at the Georgia Mountain Storytelling Festival, I'll just do one about, this feller's teeth, actually. Doesn't have anything to do with Georgia, but maybe he is going to Georgia. He sung a song probably that way. But now my daddy was the best storyteller in the world. He's the best that I had ever heard, and still remains that, though he's been passed for 21 years. And he had, there were 13 kids in his family, and we figured up one time that my grandmother had had a child every other year for like 25 years. And they were 11 boys out of 13. Well, 2 of the boys didn't live to adulthood, but all the rest of them did. And they were very close, and they talked all the time about people they knew growing up in that same little community of Sodom. And Daddy would refer to them as characters. And then he would launch into some story, about this person. And in 1997, I guess it was in November of 97, I went over to Sodom and asked Daddy if he would take me on a tour of Sodom. And he kind of looked at me funny, and he said, well, honey, you've been all over this place just like I was when I was growing up, and you know everybody in Sodom. And I said, well, yes, I do, but I want you to show me where everybody lived when you were a child. So he said, oh, okay, well, let's go. So we were going down. Now, there's one straight part of the road in Sodom, and it's called the Champ Straight. And we had gone through the Champ Straight, made that big curve where if you go off to the left, you went up into the Jack Holler. And as we got up there almost to whip back around and go into the short straight, which is literally short, Daddy stopped the car. And he said, pointed off across the little branch there and said, now, you remember Sophie, don't you? Then I said, oh, yeah, I remember Sophie. She, her and Leroy used to pile up in that old farm truck they had, that flatbed thing, and had that little old dog that would jump up on the back of it, and I had a dog named Timmy, Daddy said. That's right. And Leroy didn't really observe any kind of speed regulatory signs or anything, and so he would run the road just as fast as he could go, and he ran over that dog. And I said, yes, I remember. I wrote Sophie a letter. And Daddy said, come again. And I said, I wrote Sophie a letter after they ran over Timmy. And here's what I said. I said, Dear Sophie, you are going to hell because you ran over my dog. Period. People who run over little girls and boys' dogs goes to hell. Love, Sheila K. Adams. And Daddy remembered and started laughing. And he said, well, I do remember that. He said, do you remember her brother Irving? And I said, oh, yeah, I remember Irving Ramsey. He was a little bitty short feller, just like Sophie was. And he used to put cigarettes in each corner of his mouth, and all of us little girls would be out walking around the road, we called it, singing, holding hands, and talking and playing. And Irving Ramsey would come down out of the graveyard walking down the path with those 2 cigarettes stuck out of the side of his mouth, and it would just scare us to death every single time. So I remembered Irving. He said, well, ever told you about that time that Irving Ramsey went off down to the dentist in Marshall? Dr. Ramsey, in the 30s. And I said, no. He said, well, let me tell you what happened to him. You remember they had a little old house out behind the big house, the big farmhouse there that was Sophie's, and she was probably the richest person in Sodom because she owned all of this property that people had given to her when they passed away, and she grew tobacco, and that's why they would do that road running so much, is because they were growing tobacco all over the Rice's Cove and in Sodom. And so she lived there in the big house with her hard hand, Leroy. And I said, well, I remember Leroy too. And I reckon he was her hired hand. But Daddy, of course, pronounced it hard. And so when when Sophie started worrying about him falling or hurting himself, walking up and down the roads from old home, she said, we'll just build you a little house out behind the big house and you can live there. So they built him a little shotgun house right out behind the main house. And her hired hand stayed in the big house. And now these were people who went to bed with the chickens. I mean, literally, when it got dark, they went to bed. And so about 11:30, which was late for them, there was a knock on the back door. Well, Sophie had one of those metal bell-like lights that hung down over the back door steps, and she went and had a window in the door, and she held her lantern up and looked, and on the other side was her brother Irving. She swung that door open and said, Irving, what are you doing here now? It's almost midnight, and tomorrow's Saturday, and we're going to take you down to Marshall and get them teeth fixed that's been bothering you. And he said, well, that's what I was going to ask about, sister, was whether you'd remembered that. And she said, oh, yes, I remembered. I know you've been in pain here all week long just about it, and we're going to get that took care of tomorrow. So just do the best you can, and we'll get up early and leave tomorrow and go to Marshall, and Dr. Ramsey will fix you right up. And they did. And Dr. Ramsey did. And Irving came home, and Sophie said to him, now, Irving, I'm wore out because when I get woke up out of a sound sleep, I can't go back to sleep again. And now we've got to be at church in the morning at 9 o'clock, and I want, because I'm teaching Sunday school class in the morning, and I want you now to stay in your little house, and I'm going to bed, and I'll come and get you in the morning. So they went to bed. Now, it's probably about 8 o'clock. Well, it hadn't been 2 hours to where, and Irving had gone to bed saying, oh, I feel just fine after supper. He had him a big, long, cold drink of buttermilk and said, boy, I'm going to sleep like the dead tonight. But that ain't what happened. About 2 hours later, he's knocking on the back door again. And Sophie, this time, she took that lantern, grabbed a hold of the doorknob, jerked it open, and stepped out onto the porch with him in her bare feet. That was serious. So, Irving was standing there with his head cocked to the side. And every once in a while he'd shake his head and kind of thump the side of his head. And Sophie said, Brother, what is wrong with you? You're acting like some sort of lunatic or a maniac or something. I said, I'm gonna have to get the law over here on you. Put you on bus 18 to Morganton now, which is, of course, for us, that's where the state hospital is. I, for years, thought bus 18 just took you down to this place called Morganton, and they just set everybody out that was a little strange or weird acting, or just kind of, they all lived amongst each other down there at Morganton. But no, there's a state hospital down there. So, no, Irving didn't want to go down there. And what he did was thump the side of his head. His mouth fell open. He said, Sister, did you hear that? And she said, hear what? You know, why, I'm hearing people talk, but it's in a foreign language. Sounds like I can't make out a single word of it. Sophie said, Lord, have mercy. And right there on the spot, she got on her knees and said the Lord's Prayer. And she said, at the end of the prayer, thank you, God. I am so your servant, and so is my brother Irving, because you have allowed him not to hear the clear words of Satan, but to hear that mystery of the Lord. He's a-talking in tongues, hearing it in tongues. So, watch over him, God, tonight, and we'll be at church even earlier in the morning. And so, Irving looked kind of, I don't know so much about this, but Sophie said, I promise you it'll be fine. God has given me a sign. So, the next morning, they got up real early. She asked him if he was hearing anything. No, he wasn't hearing a word now. Good, she said, but we still got to talk to preacher Manasseh about it. And he said, okay. So up the road they walked to church, and they got up there. And everybody brought their Bible with them. That's just the way that it was. And Hobart Bowman was standing there at the door. And he had his big Bible that was well thumbed. He was a most beloved preacher over there in Sodom. And Irving went up to him, and Sophie right behind him. And she said, now they were about the same height, and she kind of stepped around to the side and made herself spokeswoman. And she said, Preacher Bowman, you've got to help my brother Irving here. He's a-talking, or he's a-hearing things. But now he says he can't understand a word that they're saying. So my idea is that it's the language of the Lord being spoke inside his head. It might even be angels, because what he's hearing, it's in tongues. And Hobart said, well, let me see. And he opened up his Bible, and he read. And since they'd gotten there fairly early, no problem. He's reading, and finally he stopped. And kind of muttered to himself as he read out through there. And then he looked. Now, he was a big, tall man. He was like 6'3" or 4, and weighed about 170 pounds or so, tall and thin. And he looked down at Sophie and Irving with the most sorrowful look on his face. And he said, well, Sister Sophie, now I hate to be the relayer of just awful news, but now if he's hearing talking in his head, and it is in tongues, now and he patted his Bible and said, I'm pretty self-assured that he's got 7 days to live from when he first heard him. Oh my goodness gracious. Well, Sophie said, well, Lord have mercy. And Irving turned as white as a sheet. And Sophie said, well, we'll have to have a camp meeting right down there at the house all week long for the rest of this week for 7 days. Till next Saturday, there's going to be a camp meeting down at the house, and I'll feed everybody and make sure that everybody's comfortable. Just they can bring their wagons in and put feather ticks in the bed of them, and we'll just have us a camp meeting right there at the house. And the preacher, he got up and told everybody, and they prayed for Irving and prayed for him, and the preacher offered to even baptize him again. They had a baptizing pool in the branch there behind the house, and Irving said no, he didn't believe he'd need all that. Sakes, it was just, he couldn't even hear him now. And so that's the way it was for the entire week that folks started showing up. First, it was just the group from the Baptist church there, and that they were members of, which was the Missionary Baptist. Well, now in Sodom, we had every flavor of Baptist you can imagine. Free will, hard shell, regular, plain old, primitive Baptist, progressive primitive Baptist, holy rolling, speaking in tongue Baptist, and we had buzzard Baptist. Now, that Josh Goforth feller that I mentioned, he's going to tell you that he's the one that told me about that buzzard Baptist thing. Or he'll own up to it anyway, because he was. I rattled him off one night, and he said, well, you forgot buzzard Baptist. And I got it right off. Them's Baptists that only go to church when there's a funeral. So, there's your buzzard Baptist. So, the Missionary Baptists, though, they were having a big revival down there. Well, now I tell you what. This was at a time of the year when people didn't have a whole lot to do. And so every flat spot there around Sophie's house by the next Saturday was full. There must have been 1,000 people. Them Baptists that had swarmed off from the church. Now, Daddy used to say Baptists are bad to get into a big argument about something. Part of the congregation will fuzz up and swarm off down the road and build another Baptist church wherever a tree is cut down or the road's forked. So that's why there's so many Baptists. But he said, I bet you there's 1,000 people down in them places next to the branch, you know, where and all. And he said they was on their knees praying every time you went by there. Now, there weren't no road or nothing like they is now. It was just a little like cow path. But people could still, you know, see across to Sophie's house in that big flat place where her house sat. Why, it was full of wagons and people laying in bed rolls on the porch. She had one of those wraparound porches that went all the way around the house. And her just a-feeding and a-giving away buttermilk, cow's milk. And Irving looked kind of confused all week because not a sound. Not a single sound that entire week. So on Saturday, when Sophie was saying, well now, I don't know, but it's getting up about the time that he told me last Saturday that he had heard of me. You know, it's not quite 7 o'clock, and I reckon it was a little after it got plumb dark when he come to the door last Saturday. But I just don't know. And then all of a sudden, her brother Irving interrupted her, and that very rarely happened. And he said, wait a minute. Now, Daddy said, you cannot believe how quiet 1,000 praying out loud at the top of their lungs Baptists can shut her up when the dead man walking shouts out, wait a minute. Daddy said it went completely quiet. And there on the front porch, part of the porch, was Sophie and Preacher Bowman and Irving, and that was it. And Daddy said the preacher towering up above the two of them, one on each side. And Sophie said, well now, Irving, and Irving said, held his hand out like to stop her, and Daddy said the time was straight up 7 o'clock. And he said, is heaven in Mexico? And Hobart Bowman said, what are you talking about? They ain't nothing that mentions in the holy book about heaven being in Mexico. And he said, well, I just heard somebody. Oh my goodness gracious, has the Carter family passed on? And I'm understanding every word they're saying too. And Daddy said that he opened his mouth big and wide And you could hear it all the way across her yard and into that little path where Daddy and all of his brothers was setting to watch. Keep on the sunny side, always on the sunny side, because live across the border, live south of the border at something like XOEO. And it was John Brinkley, who got into some trouble using goat parts in human beings that weren't supposed to be there. And he practiced in medicine, and he was not a doctor. He was a snake doctor, as Daddy called him. And he was also sort of a little bit leaning toward a criminal. And he had built in Kansas the largest radio tower ever. And it was just taking over the whole airwaves. At 7 o'clock every night, every Saturday, you could not hear another single channel on the radio except the one live south of the border. And Daddy said it's amazing how the head acts just like a speaker. And I said, well, yeah, that's why that's what it's designed to do. He said, well, you could hear every word that was said. The Carter family is singing all the way across over into the road. I said, well, I can't imagine in Sodom that somebody didn't. Oh, he said, oh, they did. They certainly did. He said, they kept Irving Ramsey. If he wasn't at the store at 6 o'clock on Saturday, somebody'd go and get him and bring him down there and make him sit out on the store porch. And they would prop his mouth open with ice cream sticks, those little ice cream spoons like you used to get, and he would have to sit there until that program went off. And, of course, everybody was more interested in the talent that was there than they were in his snake oils and cures for this, that, and the other. But he went down to Mexico and built the tallest radio tower that's ever been up until I think they built one somewhere over in Asia that's taller than that one was. And what was happening was when Irving went to the dentist with his teeth, well, the dentist just filled that whole side, like they'll do, and took care of all that whole side with filling that was being used at that time, late 30s, early 40s, and it had mercury in it. And as a result of the mercury in the fillings that were put in that whole side of Irving's teeth, well, he was picking up radio signals. And what he said was, well, I still don't understand it, but I can tell you this much, I was hearing it better out of my left ear than I was my right. Now, that's the kind of stories that I tell. The ones that Daddy told me, and as you can see, they are, well, Daddy always said, you can be guaranteed of one thing, honey. I will always have a kernel of truth in every story that I tell you, or everything that I say to you is going to have a kernel of truth. So, anyway, that's a story about Irving Ramsey and south of the border. And what I thought I'd do now is sing a love song. Now, that's what my family called it, singing love songs. And we would, Granny, well, let me start with when Granny was a girl. Granny said that when she was a girl that they would have frolics, and we had frolics too, but we called them square dancings. And you'd move all the furniture, she said, out in that was in the house, and they were at different people's houses all the time. And they'd move all the furniture out into the yard and pile it up in a big pile. And then they'd just dance all over the house. And I said, well, gosh, Granny, I mean, weren't you worried that like it'd rain or, snow or weather get on it or something? And then she said, oh, no, it wouldn't have done nothing but just washed it off. And that wouldn't have been a bad thing. And so we'd do that, she said, till gosh, way up in the night. Sometimes it'd be 11 o'clock, 11:30. Young'uns would be laid in on this constant. She said it was just one big feather bed where people had fetched feather beds and put them up in the loft. Young'uns had already gone to sleep, and the musicianers had gotten tired. She said they would take a break, and that was when all the love song singing would start. And she said they would just sing and sing and sing, and then the musicianers would come back and they'd go back to dancing. But those love songs that she was talking about are what I mentioned earlier, the English and Scottish ballads that were brought over here by mainly the women of my family. And over here, definitely, the women became the keepers of this tradition of singing the story songs or the ballads. And it was a strict oral tradition. When I was growing up, I was born in 53, started learning them in 58. And I remember the first one I heard was Dillard Chandler standing on Granny's porch, and she was bump rocking me to sleep, in just a straight back chair with no rockers on the four legs. It's just bump, bump, bump. But I'd better not do that or I'll just fall asleep standing here. But it was a pretty night. It was in the late spring, early summer, like June or so. And he was standing on the porch looking out down the valley, and off in the distance you could see Little Ball Mountain in Tennessee. So he started singing and sang Soldier Traveling from the North. So I'm gonna try to do justice to Dillard Chandler's song. Dillard was a real interesting character, and if you want to get to know Dillard, John Cohen, who was a folklorist, passed a couple of years ago. This month actually, or maybe it was last year this time. But anyhow, John Cohen made a movie, and Dillard's in, and it's called End of an Old Song, and it was filmed in the early to mid 60s, and all of the people that you see in that film are my family. My granny, Dale, as I called her, she was my great aunt, but I called her Granny, and her sister Barzell, and Kaz Walling, and Lee Walling, and Dillard. And since Dillard never married and had any children, now we would have said young'un over home. But he never had any young'uns, and so I decided that I probably would need to preserve his songs. And my family have got the longest unbroken oral tradition of passing down these ballads of anybody in this country. So I'm awful proud of that.